Welcome to the Unknown Webcast. When I spoke with our guest on Sunday to outline how the webcast runs, I had to warn her that I am so conservative, I can't turn left even when I'm driving. So that requires a word of warning for folks who are joining us. This is not a safe space for those who are easily offended by having their ideas challenged. This is broadcast number 91, and this week we have Hillary Morgan Ferrer, founder, cohort, chief executive troublemaker of Mama Bear Apologetics, whose tagline is "Mess with our kids and we will demolish your arguments." Today our theme is "Don't Mess with Mama's Kids." My name is Don Vino, and I'm president of Midwest Christian Outreach Inc. in Wonder Lake, Illinois, which produces the Unknown Webcast. And our senior researcher is still Ron Hensel, who will introduce the sponsors of today's webcast. And here is Ronnie, baby.
Greetings from Florida, where the palm trees came out, saw their shadow, and now we have 12 more months of summer. Our sponsors today include World's End Theology Outlet, your one-stop resource for half-baked heresies, dubious doctrines, and other ideas whose time has gone. World's End Theology Outlet, and the Bible Buffet. It's not your father's worship experience, the Bible Buffet. And to ensure continued access to this program, please go to MidwestOutreach.org. Find and click on that yellow donate button and contribute as you feel led. If you like us, please help support us. If you don't like us, maybe you can annoy somebody else with our program at MidwestOutreach.org. And here we are.
And here we are. Ron is kind of our resident smart guy and tries to keep me on track. Hillary, this is kind of a funny little story to me. I had seen the Mama Bear Apologetics from my friend Dr. Doug Grothheis, and I thought, I better check into that. And so I did, and I liked what I saw, and I emailed, and only to discover that she is married to an occasional contributor to our journal, John Ferrer.
So you didn't realize that.
Yeah. I was shocked and amazed, and she's smart besides. So that's good.
Well, there you go.
So tell us about Mama Bear Apologetics. What is it? Whose idea was it? And why are you talking to us today?
Okay, so Mama Bear Apologetics is something I came up with probably... It was over a period of time, maybe in 2015, where I started realizing that moms were kind of left out of the apologetics conversations a lot of times. I kind of jokingly call moms the 1040 window of apologetics, because a lot of times what happens is you'll have an apologetics conference and all the men are like, yay, go. And then someone has to stay home with the kids. And so who's that going to be? Dad wants to go to the conference. Mom stays home with the kids. However, if you look at some of the research on who is getting questions first, like there was this one article I saw from the UK that was talking about how moms, especially moms of young children, get an average of 300 questions a day. And so even talking with other friends that are moms, it's like, even if there is something like a tornado, the kids come to them first. And like my partner, Rebecca, was saying, when there's something scary going on, the kids come to her and she says, no, I'm going to daddy. And, then they all go to dad. According to some research, kids start going to dad more maybe in the mid-teen age, but like teens and 20s, dad becomes more important. But before then, every question goes to mom. I mean, I have friends who say they've watched their kid has walked past their father sitting on the couch watching TV to go into the bathroom where she's taking a shower so that she can open up something for them, like a, juice pack or something like that. For some reason, mom is the place to go for all the questions. So I thought if mom is the place to go for all the questions, that's probably where we're getting our spiritual questions first. And so if moms don't know how to defend the faith to their kids, then that we're missing out on basically our frontline troops. And so we need to have something that is tailored for moms. And so I started trying to think about, why is it that maybe moms don't get as involved? And so one of them, I think, is just, the childcare aspect. If there's a conference, it's either having to figure out babysitting or stuff. And a lot of times they just say, I'm just going to stay home. But secondly, a lot of times they don't have time to do anything during the day. They are constantly answering questions, picking up messes, making lunches, driving kids here, driving kids there. And so I remember seeing an interview with, I think it was Steve Jobs, where he was talking about before he created the iPod and the iPad and all those things. And he said that everybody else was creating something new to do, you know, like the Wii system and, you know, just creating new things for people to do. He said, I wanted to figure out what people were already doing and then figure out a way for them to interact with it in a new way. And so that's where he came up with the iPad, because people are already reading, people are already reading the newspaper and magazines and stuff like that. So he created a new way to interact. So I thought, how can I do this in a way that is not adding something to moms' already busy lives, but is integrating into their life? And so the number one thing I thought was, they don't have time to just sit down and read. Kids will interrupt you like every 20 seconds. And my mom, watch me do this. Mom, watch me do that. So I thought, we need something audio, something that they can listen to. And it can't be in lecture form, because I've tried to listen to lectures while I was multitasking, while I was doing the dishes or folding laundry. It's really hard to multitask with just lecture format. But I find that women have a tendency to watch a lot of talk shows during the day while they're doing stuff. And I think we have this innate ability to follow a conversation while we're doing stuff in a way that we can't with other things. So I thought, we need to have this information out there, and it needs to be presented in a conversational form. So it's just like two gals having a conversation. So I called it, at first I thought I was just going to do a blog, but then, you know, I felt led, I think we really need to do podcasts. So I called my friend Rebecca Valerius up and said, hey, do you want to start a podcast with me? And she was just super excited. So for about a year, we had to teach ourselves how to podcast, how to do a website, basically how to teach ourselves all the technical stuff. But now we're going, yep, there's our website. So now we're kind of up and going, and we still make mistakes occasionally, but we've had a lot of good feedback from people saying, I love listening to your podcasts, or moms that are coming home on a plane that, you know, a really long international flight. And they said, oh, I totally binge listened to 7 of your podcasts. And so, yeah, I like being able to just equip in ways that are convenient for them.
So that's mamabearapologetics.org, right?
It's actually .com. I don't know if I'm supposed to do .org, like, since we're an organization. We just picked, I'm more used to .com, so we did .com.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
That works. So, okay, so I want to ask you a question then, from a female sort of perspective versus male, because it is my experience and contention that females tend to be more relational in the things they do. Males tend to be more task-oriented in the things they do. Which means that when, for example, Ron and I and other guys I know, if we're talking about the problem of evil, it usually is revolving around a philosophical question. It doesn't have a personal attachment to it necessarily.
We're so impersonal. We're just very impersonal.
Well, it's not that we're so. It's task. Hey, I kind of tell a story like this, and I do this when I preach a lot and trying to help people understand the differences between my wife and I, at least. I don't know, and I think this is generally true. Is when we were first dating, and she said to me one day, "Do you want to? Would you go to the store with me? I would need to buy a blouse." And I said, "Well," thought about it, and I thought, "Yeah, we're." 15 minutes from a mall, called it Yorktown Mall. J.C. Penney's is there, so like 17 minutes, we'll get to the mall, get out of the car, walk in the front door. We'll be in the women's section. She'll get a blouse. It'll be blue, whatever size she wears. 22 minutes, we'll be in and out. We're done.
Oh, you naive American. You naive American. Yes.
Oh, this has been early in marriage.
And I said, sure. And so we went to the mall and we wandered around. And after about 26 minutes, we're going, she's not even looking at blouses. What are we doing here? And then I realized that it wasn't about buying a blouse. It was about the relationship. We're going to walk through the mall. We're going to have a Coke. We're going to look in windows. We're going to talk about life stuff. We're going to be. And so by 38 minutes, I was losing my mind.
Well, it's a good thing you didn't marry somebody from one of the other 57 genders.
Well, there were only 2 at the time. So I think Facebook has 74 now. You're behind.
I'm behind the times. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. 3 weeks ago was 74, so it's changes fast. So Regarding apologetics, I go that direction to ask this question. I have just found, now, again, it's not a professional study or poll or anything like that, just my observation, that usually when a woman contacts me to ask about the problem of evil, it's because her friend's husband just got cancer.
Yes.
Right? It's a relational question. Now, all of that to get to this, is that your experience with Mama Bear Apologetics? As you talk about conversational, does that have something to do with it? Is this idea about the relationship that moms have with their kids and others?
Absolutely. In fact, there's an article I wrote for crossexamine.org a couple months ago before our Women in Apologetics conference that's titled, "Yes, Women Need Apologetics, but more importantly, apologetics needs women." And so a lot of times people focus so much on how can we get the apologetics to the women that they don't realize why just the field of apologetics needs women themselves. And one of my points on there is that women are innately more relational in their ministry. Mary Jo Sharp, who most apologists know, has noticed that when she has people come up and ask questions after she gives talks at conferences, for the men, they're coming in, they're asking their own question, and the women are usually coming on behalf of somebody. And so I found that to be absolutely the case. And I think that that's one of the reasons why we need more women in apologetics, is I think the way that we present is naturally assuming that this is going to impact your life in a real and tangible way. I think we talked before about how, men are waffles, women are spaghetti, kind of, men have all their, their drawers that they can go into, their home drawer, their work drawer, and their apologetics drawer. So when men are presenting on apologetics, they pull out their apologetics drawer and they start talking about these tools in the apologetics drawer, and then they put that drawer back. And so women hear that and they think, oh, this is really good information, but it hasn't told them how they apply it in their real life and how it's going to impact relationships. I have very rarely heard a woman give an apologetics talk where it wasn't innately about how is this going to impact your real life? How is this going to impact the way you interact with your friends or with your coworkers or with your family? And so I think that is the case, that we see somebody else struggling, and the caregiver in us is wanting to help them out. And in the past, just being compassionate and bringing over a meal and doing all that was good enough. Well, with this, just massive amount of intellectual and existential angst that we have going on right now, people are wanting to talk about real answers. But again, they don't want it just from a philosophical point of view. They need some of that philosophy, but they need it coming from a person.
So when you say when a woman comes up to an apologist and says, "I have a friend who's really struggling with X or Y or Z," it really is a friend. It's not themselves, right?
Well, I'm sure there could be some. If it's something that's super embarrassing, like I don't know, I won't label any sins as embarrassing, but or questions as embarrassing. You might have someone who isn't me has a question when it's actually them. But I think a lot of times they are coming, especially for their children, their spouse, or their friends.
Okay. I didn't mean to cut you off, but
no, that's fine. I was going to say something and I went off. My train went off track.
I did that. That was my fault. You were talking about men have compartments like waffles and women are like spaghetti. Where does that go? Where you have to kind of sift
that
through
food
the
analogy. You might need to explain it to us because it sounds like a relational thing there.
Yeah, it's basically every single part of us interacts with every other single part. So it's like whatever happens, here is also going to affect the way that I feel at work, and affects the way I treat my kids, affects everything else. Versus men can kind of be like, oh, things weren't going well here, I'll just put that away and compartmentalize, which I think God made us like that on purpose, because you think of men are meant to be the protectors. They're meant to be the warriors. And if you had these protector warriors going out and they can't get rid of all the stuff that's going on, they can't focus on what they need to do. Versus women, we're kind of having to juggle everything. We're having to juggle home, having to juggle kids, having to juggle even just interacting with other people. We log more facial expressions. In fact, in the article on why apologetics needs women, I list several studies that have been done about how women log more facial expression, or more in tune to facial expression. The amount of stimuli that we have coming in that we're registering is a lot more than men, which is why I think sometimes women can seem like just overwhelmed and overloaded, because we're just receiving a lot more information. I think men have a tendency to be able to focus. And again, this is one of those things where whenever we talk about gender, we have to say there's going to be outliers.
Well, not only that, but you're basically spouting heresy in some circles. The idea that there are actual bona fide differences between men and women that might be rooted in biology somehow, including brain biology, is just so terribly offensive. And yet, to many people, and yet these are often the same people who want to have 74 genders.
Yeah.
So there's people are living in a kind of intrinsically self-contradictory mode of thinking.
Well, I think the thing that they would disagree with would be the fact that it is absolutely intrinsically linked to biology, because it's kind of interesting. We have one camp that's trying to say there's no difference between men and women. But then if you look at the transgender movement, they're saying, I feel like a woman in a man's body, or I feel like a man in a woman's body. That tells me that there are differences between men and women. If there weren't, they wouldn't be able to tell that they were in the wrong body. So it's like out of one side of the mouth, they're saying
or believe they're in the wrong body, because then we have this other problem was, okay, what does a woman feel like? And I have to tell you, I've talked with women and I've asked that question, and they said, I don't know. I know what I feel like. I don't know what a woman feels like.
Yeah. and there's people who really don't fit the gender stereotype. Like, actually, I'm actually one of those women that I've been told by a psychologist, you kind of think more like a guy. And I had more guy friends growing up, and I really enjoyed being with my guys. I didn't understand girls. And it wasn't until college and that I said, you know what, I really need to focus on being one of the girls. I need to focus on learning because I knew one day I was going to get married and I couldn't have all these guy friends anymore because it's not appropriate. And so I kind of female and femininity is something I had to learn. And it's not something that like really came naturally for me at first. So I can understand that feeling, but I think it was more like I was squashing some of those characteristics down more than they just weren't there. But there's still times when I don't understand women, and that's a personality thing, because I'm learning more and more about the Myers-Briggs right now with this job my husband and I have, that you can have, it's like you really can't pigeonhole any of these personalities to a single gender. There are trends that, if you look at the Myers-Briggs, the feeler versus the thinker. The feeler does tend to be more in women, but I know lots of men that are feelers and overthinkers. And the difference between these is, how do you make decisions? Do you make decisions based on outcome based, or do you make it on making sure that you maintain a certain level of harmony within a group? Yeah.
So we don't get too sidetracked. I mean, all this is really, this is important, I think, an important base to talk about this topic, because we receive information differently as individuals, and I would say as genders. We transmit information differently. When I teach on trying to reach someone in a cult, for example, I almost have to start with, before we talk about doctrine, ask the question, why are they in there? Right? Because if you're going to talk to, say, a Jehovah's Witness and try to persuade them to leave, if they joined because they had no friends before joining, then talking about the Trinity is not going to be helpful, because they are there because they now have friends they never had before.
Yeah.
If you're talking to a Jehovah's Witness who believe they have been deceived because, as a, say, Roman Catholic, they have been taught to believe in the Trinity, but they had no defense for the Trinity, and the Watchtower has now persuaded them that it's pagan, now doctrine is what is going to reach them. Why they're in there is important. How they receive information is important. If my thing is just to challenge them and say the Watchtower is a false prophet, and they're going, no, this is mom for me, then that's not helpful. So how I give information, how they receive information, and what kind of information we're talking about, all comes into play. This is true in apologetics. That's why I needed to talk about this.
So, Hillary, what kinds of issues do you find yourself dealing with mostly? Is that your answering machine, Don? I take it it's the answering machine. You probably visit a lot of apologetics websites and know generally what kind of goes on there. Probably looked at their podcasts. What makes yours different as a result of everything you've just said?
Well, one of the things that we try to do, and like let me tell you some of the we have a couple little things that we say for in Mama Bear, like in our intro and our outro and just in general. Number one is at the end of our intro for our podcast, we say this may not affect your faith, but it might affect your children's. The idea of a mama bear is she's not doing something for herself. A mama bear is specifically protecting someone else. And for some reason, out of the entire animal kingdom, everybody knows if you see a young bear, don't go near it, because a mama bear is there and she is vicious and she will protect.
Yeah.
And so I see women, a lot of times they may not be as interested in apologetics for themselves. They have to see how these issues are entering in to their children's lives and how this can affect their children's faith. So basically, we're trying to take all the topics that anybody else would talk about and then try to specifically target what are the ways your children will struggle with this? What are the questions your children are going to hear? What are some analogies that are age appropriate that your children can understand in order to explain this to them? So
I think men and fathers are definitely going to be interested in this.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it's funny that you should say that, that women have this protective attitude toward their kids. I mean, that's pretty well known. Earlier, you were saying the men are the protectors. Well, yes, the men protect the family, you might say, and the women protect the children.
Yeah.
So there's protectiveness in both.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, to protect the family. Yeah, I think the family and the community and they are the protectors. But when it comes specifically to the children, I think the moms are the first ones to go in there.
Oh yes, they sure are.
You'll hear stories of like little old ladies whose grandchild fell under a car and was able to lift up a car to get the child out. There's like these superhuman feats of strength that
one of my favorites. I read this, I don't know, back in the 80s. There was a family going through, I think it was Yosemite or one of these big national parks that have a lot of wild animals, and they were driving through, and in the back in the trailer section, it was kind of like a moving camper. There was a little toddler playing at a table. The grandmother was nearby. Somehow through the window leaps one of these wildcats and pounces on the child. Within, I don't know, 3 seconds, the grandmother had a steak knife and plunged it through the heart of the wildcat. It was, it was one of these campers that has like a kitchen and and it was like, boom, it happened that fast. The wildcat was dead, never had a chance.
Yeah.
So, yes, that's the story that comes to my mind.
That would be a good one. There's a grandmama bear right there.
This is important, and we have written extensively, and you probably are not familiar with a lot of our stuff, but on kind of the state of the church, which is in general not good. Now, there are some really good churches. I happen to go to a really good church, but in general, they tend to not do really good at teaching just essential orthodox views of the faith.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, mamas who are, as you point out, really busy and everything is sort of interconnected and going on all the time, have kind of this idea that the church is preparing my child in the faith for the future. And that is just not the case.
Yeah. In fact, on our About Mama Bear page, we cite a study that was done where they found that kids that grew up in Sunday school had a tendency to have a less biblical worldview than those who did not grow up in Sunday school. And so it's like, why is that? Why are we growing up in Sunday school? Well, part of it is all of these things are being presented as stories and not as history. And so it's one of those things where the kids are actually getting inoculated and taught, this only has to do with this felt character that you put on a felt board and you see. One of the ladies that kind of inspired Mama Bear is a woman at my parents' old church who she got up. My husband and I were called in to kind of oversee, kind of just be there for an apologetics series that they were doing. And just in case anybody had extra questions, we were just kind of hanging out there. And this one lady stands up and gives her testimony. about how she got into apologetics. She was not interested in it. Her kids were raised in Awana and, then youth group. And I think they were baptized, and even one of them rededicated his life before going to college. So she thought they were set. In fact, this is her whole story is on, I think, oh golly, it's like the second and third podcast. It says interview with Jody Weiss, and it's what happens when your children leave. But what she did was, when her son came home and said, I don't believe in God anymore, she said, okay, what are your questions? And so he would give her all of her questions, and she had never studied this kind of stuff, all the philosophy, all the apologetics, never studied it for herself. But she thought, by golly, I'm going to study this for him. So she would study until he came home again, and then they would talk about it. And then he'd give her some more questions, and then she would do the same thing. She was not a scholar. She was a fitness instructor. I can't remember if she had a bachelor's or not, but she made that happen, and she rose up. And to me, that's almost like the intellectual version of the grandmother leaping across the yard to stab the bobcat, or the person lifting the car off the child. It's finding what is it that's attacking my child's faith and going full gusto in order to protect it. And that's the mama bear instinct. And that's where Mama Bear Apologetics got its name. I said, how can we harness this for spiritual matters?
Yeah, well, it's really important, because sometimes it comes down to definitions. I mean, you might have the right word for something, but the definition that's being applied to it is an unbiblical definition. And we have that. In fact, this weekend, we're celebrating something that is near and dear to many of us, the resurrection. And, sometimes because of a lack of clear definition, you have what we might call a rhino. In fact, we have one of our sponsors talks about it.
Yeah. Well, okay. So we want to hear from our friends at World's End Theology Outlet, and they have something you can't find anywhere else. Ooh. It's called the End Time Rhino, Resurrection in Name Only. It's perfect for ad hoc theologizing, fits any millennial position, and works with cremations. Well, how does it work, you ask? Well, here's how it works. Notice this beautiful cemetery before the resurrection. And now notice it after the resurrection. Can't tell the difference? Hey, neither can we. And just think of all the advantages. Nothing to clean up. Cuts down on expenses, food, clothing, and shelter. Never worry about your appearance again. Yes, the End Time Rhino, Resurrection in Name Only, is available only at World's End Theology Outlet, your one-stop resource for half-baked heresies, dubious doctrines, and other ideas whose time has gone. So here the problem is the definition of resurrection. Is that what you were getting at, Don?
It is, absolutely. Some years ago, in 1990 and 91, 92, we had an issue going on with a professor at one of the leading seminaries who had a book out claiming that Jesus was raised bodily. So it said bodily, and we believe that. The problem was, he said, it wasn't physical. It was a spirit body. And so it was his body was not normally part of his, how did he put it?
So spirits can now eat fish and be touched and stuff. That's interesting.
Well, but he said that he manifested bodies temporarily, but nonetheless, really, for evidential reasons for the eyes of the disciples. But that it was not normally because they couldn't see him continuously. And so I wrote to one of the other professors that examined him and had decided that indeed he is Orthodox. I said, okay. You have never seen me. You're not currently seeing me, although you're reading what I wrote to you, and you probably won't see me in the future. Does that mean that I am normally invisible and incorporeal? And he wrote back and said, just talk to this other professor. So we have a problem here where he's claiming to believe in the resurrection, but denying the very element of it, the substance of the physical body. And it took several years for us to get this resolved. Finally, the professor recanted, and the school took a solid Orthodox position. But that shouldn't be. However, it affects then others who go to school at those institutions and come out and pastor in churches. And how do moms pass that on to their kids? What do they tell them about the resurrection? So how do you deal with those kinds of things? Definitions.
Okay, so first off, definitions. The Mama Bear Apologetics, we have been We just signed a book deal with Harvest House back at the end of last year. So we will be having a book that's coming out. And one of the things it's going to be dealing with is kind of funny. We sort of, I'm not sure if this is what the chapter is going to be called. We've played around with it, but redefinitionalism. We thought it was funny to make up a word to talk about how people are changing the definitions of words. We might change that, but right now that's how we refer to it. But yeah, one of the things that we see is people are trying to take orthodox words and then just change the definition of it, and so it basically impedes any ability to discuss on things, because you have two people saying the same word and they mean completely different things. We see this happening right now when people use the word feminism. When they use the word feminism, you have some people that are picturing first wave feminism, where it was, the right to vote, to equality of the genders, versus the third wave feminism, which is all about a woman needs a man like a fish needs a bicycle kind of attitude. Third wave feminism, I would say, is all about trying to devalue men in order to raise the value of women. But if someone says, oh, I'm against feminism, then this person's going to immediately picture, oh, so you think they should be barefoot and in the kitchen. Our ability to use words, and I think the enemy taking words and twisting words is probably one of the biggest problems that we have right now. Another word that we see this happening with is love. Just, oh, Jesus called us to love. Well, if we completely change the definition of love to be where love now means celebrating sin and telling people they're perfect the way they are, and that's love, well, now I can accuse a Christian of saying, God called you to be loving. But the problem that we're having is with the definition and not with the word. So we are going to be dealing with this issue in the book that's coming out. But I think anytime Rebecca and I, or any of the other mama bears that I do the podcast with, when we get to a point where like, I've heard people really misuse this, we usually try to address it at the time. For example, a few years ago, actually it was just last year, maybe, I can't remember when, Rebecca and I did a section on the resolutions of Jonathan Edwards, like the most epic list of resolutions ever made. And as we were talking about it, we realized that we kept dropping the word legalism. And I thought, you know what? Not everybody grew up in the church and knows what that phrase means. And so not only did we end up doing another podcast talking about legalism, but we did a whole blog describing this is what we mean by legalism. So the battle for words is important. And not only just to have that word, but if our purpose is to have productive conversations with people. It's like, if I want to speak to someone who speaks another language, I need to know what their words mean. The problem we have right now is we have a bunch of English-speaking people who have changed definitions of words, and we're having as much confusion as you would see trying to go over to a foreign country where, except for this time, we're using the same word, but we're meaning different things. And so I'm trying to remember who it was with me. It might have been Pascal. I can't remember. I'm bad with knowing who said what or where it is, but he said, Voltaire. It was Voltaire. If you wish to converse with me, first define your terms. Yeah. And so coming to an agreement on what these words mean first is the only way you can have a conversation. And I think we have such blowouts going on with people, not only in the Christian community, but between Christians and skeptics, because they keep talking past each other and they don't realize that the words that we're using, we're not referring to the same thing. And so these people are defending against this definition, while these people are meaning this definition, and it sounds like this person's attacking that definition. And there's just so much confusion. That's just all about, I don't know, the enemy comes to bring confusion. And one of the ways he's doing that right now is just really messing with language.
Well, we see that we see that both in the dialogue between Christians and non-Christians. You mentioned love. Hey, the Apostle John says, love not the world. Mm-hmm. There are things we're not supposed to love.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean we're not supposed to love the people in the world, but John goes on to say, all that is in the world is this: the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life. The worldly attitude, it's the same worldly attitude that drives the people in the world. And that means occasionally we're going to have to point that out. And that's not going to sound loving to them. But it also happens within the church. I think it was Charles Ryrie who said, it used to be good enough to say that the Bible was inspired. Everybody knew what you meant when you said that. And then suddenly it wasn't enough. You had to now say the Bible is inspired and infallible. And then after a while, that wasn't enough. You had to say the Bible was inspired, infallible, and verbally inspired and infallible. And then finally you had to say the verbally
inerrant.
Yeah, verbally inspired, infallible, inerrant, word of God, because people kept changing the meaning of those terms. And now I do believe people are messing with the meaning of the word inerrant now. So
yeah, they are.
What's next?
Oh, there's so much more that can happen. I always point people to that because I find an improper definition of inerrant not only there's a type of doubt that I talk about. I have been, for the last couple of years, I've been giving a talk called Diagnosing Doubt, and it's basically looking at all the different aspects that can cause someone to doubt. It would be the flip side of saying what brings people to faith, and because it's not just an intellectual thing, there's an emotional part going on, there's an intellectual, there's your behaviors, and there's even sometimes a physiological component to how you're interacting with the faith. And when we see things go wrong in those 4 areas, and just in our spirit life, when we see something go wrong in those areas, then people can experience doubt in different ways. But I'm trying to remember where I was going with that now. you were talking about, the inerrant. We have people who get a definition of inerrant and they think, oh, that means there's absolutely nothing different with all the, now probably close to 30,000, manuscripts that we have. There's absolutely nothing that's different between all of those. And then when they hear someone like Bart Ehrman say there are more differences in these texts than there are verses in the Bible,
which isn't true, but go ahead.
Well, depending on how you define it,
depending on how you count variance.
Yeah, the variance. Because if you have an older thing that has John spelled Jon, another one that spells it Jonn, and that second one is in 15,000. Copies. Now you have 15,000 variants.
The problem is that's not the way textual critics count variants. That's just not the way they do it. But go ahead.
So anyway, I like to always point people back to the Chicago Statement of Inerrancy because it actually really allows for some of the discrepancies that we do see going on. And so if we're not getting a correct definition of inerrant, then what happens is people have this expectation, this faulty expectation of what inerrant is. And then when they discover that the Bible doesn't hold up to that, all of a sudden their whole world is blown. They don't feel like they can trust anything. And sometimes they end up walking away. And this is what I call expectational doubt, when you have an expectation that was not met. Causing you to experience either doubt or to walk away. And I think
that describes Bart Ehrman. He had an expectational doubt. That's his testimony. Basically.
Yeah. Bart Ehrman basically was if you look at his history, he was a hyper-fundamentalist Christian. With hyper-fundamentalism, you're not going to find almost any wiggle room. He has taken that personality style and has now applied it to his atheism. So it's not like he's changed per se. He's just changed where he applied his hyper-fundamentalism to. Yeah. And so like when we were at a debate with him and someone asked him, what would it take for him to say, okay, what we have is what was originally written? Because he'll say the same thing over and over again. How do you know for sure? How do you know that's like his whole argument. How do you know for sure? And so someone asked him, okay, what would be good enough evidence for you? And so he said he wanted an original dated within 2 weeks of the event. So basically, as a historian, he is asking for something that has never existed with any part of history. He wants absolute certainty with these documents, or else he won't agree with anything. But if he were to apply that to all the rest of his work, as a historian, he would have to walk in for his big talk and say, we can't know anything for sure. Thank you. Good night. Because that's all he can say.
About anything in history, especially in ancient history.
Yeah. So it's like if you're applying a standard for scripture that's higher than any other ancient source and it just doesn't exist anywhere, I would call that irrational skepticism. That's an irrational belief right there. That's that hyper-fundamentalism now applying itself to a kind of irrational hyper-fundamentalism towards atheism.
Now, that what you talk about, the atheistic or unbelieving hyper-fundamentalism is there, and it's been enjoying a surge in popularity. But I would say that what we're seeing in most liberal theological circles that tried to get back into the church during the emergent movement, I think, and I don't think they succeeded. I hope at least. I think they're pretty much been, kicked out. But I trace that back to, I'm sure everybody, do you know of churches that are, trying to be both evangelical and emergent in the style of, what's his name, Brian McLaren and things like that? I think they've been, okay, so they're still there, but
they're very much there. In fact, one of our other Mama Bears, Elisa Childers, she has a lot of experience with this. And that's kind of like her lane. That's what she talks on. We have, I think, 3 different podcasts addressing this on the Mama Bear site.
Okay.
One of them is written last year around Easter. It was called The Trouble with Easter, How to and Not to Teach Your Kids About Easter. And so the title of that podcast is The Progressive Gospel, a Gospel at All? But it's dealing with churches right now that are experiencing this. And in fact, Elisa writes on it a lot. So if you can see our podcast with her or just check out her thing. Anyway, it's a lot.
In my neck of the woods, Emergent never really got here in Southwest Florida. And a lot of them have been, like Brian McLaren is no longer on the board of Christianity Today, and for good reason. It's just they clearly went off the deep end. And I trace this back to the 1980s when I was working at a particular seminary that Don and I both know is kind of left-leaning, and I never would have probably read the Christian Century magazine if not for the fact that the seminary subscribed to it. Christian Century is a very liberal.
We can name the seminary. That's not a secret.
Oh, Northern Seminary.
Northern Baptist Theological Seminary.
It was called, the full name back then was Northern Baptist Theological Seminary.
Is that in Virginia?
No, now it's actually moved to Lisle. Is it now in Lisle, Illinois? Or
it was in Lombard, Illinois.
It was in Lombard. Now, I don't know how it is today. I know how it was then. And the student body was more conservative than the faculty in many cases. Mm-hmm. And I would read these issues as they came out, and it became obvious to me that the big shibboleth back then was the word ambiguity. It had become an idol to the liberal Christian community. And of course, if you were an evangelical, you were a fundamentalist. There was no difference, in their minds. If you believed in the inerrancy of Scripture, you were automatically pegged as a fundamentalist. Yeah. So, we're lumped right in there with Bob Jones and those guys. And so they would keep on talking about how the reason fundamentalists are the way they are is because they don't have a tolerance for ambiguity. They don't see the beauty and the mystery of ambiguity. They are just not, their constitutions are inherently allergic to ambiguity. They can't deal with it. Like we sophisticated, intellectual, liberal Christians, we understand the importance of ambiguity. So everything, the fuzzier the image, the more sacred it was.
Yeah.
The less defined the doctrine, the better it was. And we who are such, such picky people that we want to have our theology defined, we were just a kind of a lower form of life than they were. And Francis Schaeffer used to talk about how these ideas trickle down into culture. They come to philosophy, then to art, then to theology, then to the broad culture. And I think so we're about 20 to 30 years past this idolization of ambiguity, and now it's in the general culture.
It is, because most of the population in church, outside of church, doesn't matter, gets their worldview, gets their understanding of life around them by osmosis, really. We sort of absorb it from the media and from our friendships and from those kinds of things. Generally, people don't think deeply about these issues until something happens, and then they have to have a big answer. Now, my kids, they grew up in a home with 2 apologists, so they were subjected to this. We talked to everything. We talked to the TV. We talked to the radio. We talked to everything. It was part of our dinner time. It was a meal and conversation. We'd all pray together, and then whatever was going on in the world of events, we would talk about as a family. And so my kids sort of grew up with adult conversations. And when my daughter hit high school, she never was much of an apologist because she thought we were just in for the argument. She ended up having to take a stand on abortion. She was the only one in her class that was pro-life, and so she wanted to write a paper. It was in English, actually, not, and she had to write a persuasive paper. So she was going to write on slavery, Nazi Germany, and abortion, with the kind of the headline that the murder is socially acceptable. And so the teacher, who was pro-abortion, said, it's an interesting title, interesting concept, but there's no evidence that abortion is murder, therefore you can't do the paper. And so she came back angry about this. And we met with someone, a professor from Wheaton College, a good friend of mine, and he said, well, if you want to write it, you can write it, but you can't quote the Bible.
Yeah.
And I said, simple. And my daughter says, what do you mean simple? I said, you can make a reasoned argument to demonstrate that it is a human life that they're taking, and it's only acceptable because of the geography involved. It's inside the mother's womb. She wrote a paper that the teacher ended up changing her mind.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
And so next, then she had a debate in class, this topic. And she came home, she said, what do I do? And I said, well, who gets to go first? She goes, I do. I said, okay, then what you want to do is outline the arguments he's going to give and demolish those, and then make a positive presentation for your side, and he won't know what to do, which is exactly what happened. So that all happened at home. Now, that's easy for us because that's what my wife and I do as a natural course of events.
Yeah.
How does a mom who is, I'm not saying Joy didn't do these other things. She did all these other things. She was a stay-at-home mom. But how does a mom who is kind of starting from ground zero on this, her child is now 10 years old, going to school where she's learning that there's 74 genders that they can choose from.
Yeah.
Where does she even begin?
Well, I would say this is maybe some of the reasons why moms kind of like feel so overwhelmed, because once you open up your eyes to see where all these different problems are, you feel like you have to solve them all at once. And I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think we need to have grace on ourselves for knowing what we can and cannot reasonably do. So I would just be talking with the kids and finding what are some of the big ones right now. First off, like when it comes to faith, if so, finding out, does my child actually believe that Jesus lived, died, and rose again? And why do they believe it? Because all these other things, talking about gender, talking about homosexuality, talking about any other kind of, social justice, whatever, is secondary to, can they defend the fact that the foundation of our faith is firm and defendable? Because honestly, it doesn't matter what Christianity teaches if we don't know if we truly believe in Christianity. Right. If Jesus was not raised from the dead, our teaching is in vain, and we are to be pitied as fools. So I would say that would be your number one place to start. But besides that, when you're starting to see other specific things, just pick one topic, because what we're doing is not necessarily having to answer every question. And I think that's where a lot of times moms just just anybody who hasn't been growing up in this feels overwhelmed, because I think I have to be able to answer every question. But what we are doing is that we are trying to build a history for our children, that when there is a tough question and it seems like this goes against the Bible, well, if you look at it for long enough, you eventually realize this doesn't go against the Bible. I don't have to answer every question. What I want my child to have is a history of knowing that tough questions have even better answers. Because at that point, once they see that this exists, next, when they go off and they're on their own and they hear something else that goes against what Scripture teaches, they can say, well, maybe I don't know the answer to that one, but I remember that every single time I had a really big question, they were able to give an answer that finally satisfied me. So that's where now I can exercise my faith that this one will too. And if it's someone who really has the proclivities to want to discover the answers, they will go after those answers expecting for there to be answers. If you're not really sure if answers exist, you're not going to attack the questions. You're going to try to shy away from the questions.
Sure. And as a guy, I would say, so you're giving them tools to say, here's number one, you do know that what you believe is true. Number two, here's the tools that you can then use to find out more information about this particular topic that has come up. Because what some people often do is they sort of gravitate toward creating a faith of their own that is perhaps disconnected from the Bible, but they still claim that it is biblical.
Well,
and Ron has a word from one of our sponsors on this.
Yeah, there's a connection here. Don's giving us a segue here. We got a question for you. Are you tired of hearing all about the difference between the milk of the word and the meat of the word? Are you wondering when your church is going to get around to serving the ice cream and cheesecake of the word? Does your pastor take this whole Bible thing way too seriously? Well, then you need to check out the Bible Buffet. It's not your father's worship experience. Everything at the Bible Buffet is prepared with your comfort and enjoyment in view. Everything there is gluten-free, trans-fat-free, and truth claim-free. All of their dishes are piping hot and ready to eat. This week's regular Sunday specials include Aryan appetizers, Sibelian succotash, Galatian goulash, Gnostic nut salad, and Pelagian pie. And don't forget, the Bible Buffet is a fully accredited ministry of the Church of Smorgasbordianism. Yes, the Bible Buffet, it's not your father's worship experience. So...
So
gotta check
now you have been subjected, Hillary.
Yes.
So they have the tools to go and sort out this new life-changing question potentially. And Mama has trained them on how to do that, right?
Well, ideally, and it depends on when she finds us. I've had a lot of women come and say, "Oh, my children are already grown up and they've already walked away from the faith, and what do I do?" And I always feel like that's not as much my specialty to know what to do. I have a phrase on Mama Bear that I say a lot of times that I say, questions are good. Like, we want to encourage questions. Enough unanswered or poorly answered questions leads to doubt. Doubt, when left to solidify, becomes unbelief, which is really, really hard to reverse. So when we get to the really, really hard to reverse stage, that's where I guess a more specialist approach is necessary. But this would be akin to a doctor having someone who just, smoked forever or something.
Those are mostly the people that we get.
Yeah.
We get those kinds of calls.
That's also who my husband gets. And I think that's why my husband is an absolute atheist magnet. And so a lot of my studies on, I've listened to their stories of deconversion. And so I've listened to how my husband's talked to them, the questions that he asked them. And that's where I started forming a lot of these views of how can we go back in time and how can we prevent these things from happening? Because, they say an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. If someone's already at that stage, I could go on a whole diatribe of just what's going on there. But for the moms, I'm trying to mostly focus on how do we prevent that getting to that place.
Well, I think it's important to tell them is, I would ask them at least, what kind of relationship do you have with this atheist child that has a lot to do with helping you figure out what kind of approach to take. But the very next thing I would do is to say, look, I've seen children who wandered so far away from the faith that they declared themselves atheists and that they came back in later life. They need to have hope. They need to know that the Holy Spirit can work. And really, that is ultimately who we're depending upon in all cases, whether we call it, whether we think this person's going to be easy or difficult. Ultimately, it's the Spirit that has to work through the Word.
Yeah.
And so, we can, I believe in rational arguments. I believe in building a case from Scripture that demonstrates that we are not totally out to lunch, that we are not believing in a whole bunch of irrational things. But at the same time, at the end of the day, my words as a human being have no power in themselves. It's the Word of God that has the power.
Yeah.
So how do you reach them?
Yeah. So as you're helping moms, is it that you're trying to give them the, not just knowledge, but the incorporation into their daily lives of living out these answers so they come more naturally as they arise with their kids.
Yeah.
So they don't have to sit down and take an hour study on a particular question, but it just sort of flows. When something comes up, they can, in a sentence or two, outline it and then see where it progresses. Is that the kind of thing that you're doing?
We're trying to always incorporate things that are probably already going on, like learning how to spot the lies is probably one of the things, because most of the worldview lies out there are going to be wrapped in partial truth. And so we have something called the chew and spit method, where a lot of times people try to divide anything like books, music, culture, whatever. They try, this one's safe, this one's dangerous. And now I can operate on autopilot and not think about it. But if we can get them to understand that the process of discernment is, number one, you have to see things accurately. If you're not seeing it accurately, then you cannot discern. Number two, we have to recognize that truth and error will almost always be together in everything. There is not a single pastor out there who's never going to teach you a piece of heresy. And there's no atheist out there that you can't learn a nugget of truth from. It's like most of the time, these are going to be together. So learning how to spot the truth and affirm and support why this is true, spot the error, be able to explain why this is an error, why this is unbiblical, and be able to separate those two to say, okay, we can appreciate this, but we must reject this. That keeps kids from feeling like they have these areas where I can't go over here at all because mom says this is all dangerous. One day they're going to explore this music and movies and stuff like that, and they're going to discover redeeming things about them. Once they discover something redeeming about the things that were told to them were all dangerous, now who becomes the liar?
Right.
Mom and dad, the church, all of them become the liar. If we're teaching them how to spot things with what they're doing. I'm a huge advocate of when parents go to a movie, go to a movie theater that's far away. Because the time on your drive home for talking about some of the things that you see, was this true? Was this true? What about this? How would you answer this? For that whole ride home, I think that's one of the best ways we can do. It's almost like a lab portion of the learning experience.
I do too. I find it a lot of course, we've dealt a lot with Bill Gothard. We wrote a book on Bill Gothard, and this idea that you can somehow protect your children from the world around them rather than prepare your children for the world around them. Right? Yes. There's a definite difference.
Yes.
So I had a church in Colorado again that would bring me down every year, about this time of year actually, to work with their like 8th grade and then senior high kids who are getting ready to graduate. And we would spend the weekend just dealing with the question of what is a worldview, and I would explain worldviews. We go through the available worldviews and apply them. And one of my big points was everybody has one. Every person you talk to, whether they realize it or not, may not be formal, but it's there. Every book you read, every film you see has a worldview to it. And they are teaching you something, whether you realize it or not. That's why I say you would get it by osmosis. And then after we get through all of that, and we'd have a lot of Q&A. In fact, a lot of times afterwards, we would go to one of the person's house. We ended up being up till 3, 4 o'clock in the morning, just hammering me with questions. Then on the last day, we would watch a film. It was like popcorn day, right? We'd watch a film. Hidalgo is the one I liked to use. And the assignment was simple. We're going to watch the film. You have to figure out what the worldviews are, which worldviews the director and writer are telling you are the best worldviews, and which ones are the inferior, in fact, bad worldviews. And there's 3 in there. And the best worldview is animism, the American Indian character. The worst worldview is Christianity. The most respectful worldview is Islam. It's interesting. Right? But you have to pick it up as you watch the film. Once you start doing that, then you start seeing it everywhere.
Yes, you start seeing it everywhere. And I think that is my goal with Mama Bear, is to teach them enough about things in specific situations to where they start seeing it everywhere. And once they see it everywhere, then they know their child and they know how to start these conversations. I remember my mom doing this with me when I was younger. She only did it like a couple times, but that's all it took for me. was we were watching some movie at home, you know, like it's probably a tape at the time, but something happened. I can't remember what movie or what it was, but I remember my mom putting it on pause. And if some guy did something that, you know, was kind of jerky or whatever, but she put it on pause and she leaned over and she said, "You see that, Hillary? That's a red flag." So she just did that maybe once, but I realized, oh, I can spot bad character traits in movies of this is what I kind of want to avoid. And so by the time I got to college, I knew how to spot poor character because of just like a couple of times that she did that for me when watching a movie. And it just blew my mind of, I don't know why that's all it took to open my mind to that, but it really was. And so that's, I think for other people as well, opening their mind to, you can see these different worldviews portrayed for you. You can analyze things and just equip them to do them with their own kids.
Right. We had a similar kind of a thing with my daughter would always say, "Oh, Mom, you're always trying to get to the point of everything," which was true. But there was a commercial, and this really dates me, but there was a show called Three's Company. And in that show, they had commercials about Three's Company, and one of them was talking about kind of a guy being unfaithful to his wife or something. And the crowd laughs or whatever. I forget exactly the commercial, but it's along those lines. And so Joy says to the kids that were there, was my son, my daughter, and their friends, now, how would you feel if that was your dad? Right? And they go, "Oh, Mom," I think that was, "Oh, Mom, you're trying to get to the point of everything." Well, then we found out that his little friends went home, and she was watching the TV. This commercial came on, and same thing happened. And her little brother starts laughing. And what does she say? She looks at her little brother and goes, "How would you like it if that was Dad?" Right? So they're listening.
Yeah.
And to me, that is the way to teach kids. It just becomes part of what you're doing as your daily routine.
Exactly.
Now, unfortunately, we are right at the time. So Ron's got your little,
I just want people to see the website. It's mamabearapologetics.com, right? That's what you're going to see. Mess with our kids and we will demolish your arguments, which is not meant to be threatening, but it is anyways. So
listen to their podcast. You've got material up there. If they want to contact you, they would do that through your website, right?
Yep, there's a contact spot there.
And we're going to have you on again in the future and pick on you about something. We're just not sure what yet.
Okay.
We'll figure it out. Yeah.
We'll figure it out. We're really glad you're here with us. And Ron, you want to kind of walk us out of here?
I think I do. So let's do that right now. Our resident cult leader profiler is Neil before me. Our wardrobe manager is See How It Fits You. Our tinfoil hat provisioner is Justin Cates. Our Jehovah's Witnesses coverage comes from Armageddon and D Opposer. Our Mormon Archives manager is Polygamous. Our liberal denominations bureau chief is Lucy Goosey. Our transgender issue coverage comes from her. Our special correspondent for cults based on the Hindenburg disaster and flying turkeys is Ode to Humanity. Our fact-checking supervisor is Yoleg Pulling. Our technical assistance comes from Murky Research. Our legal advisors are at the law firm of Dewey, Cheatham, and Howe. Our grievance resolutions director is Giovanna Pisami. Our director of privacy assurance is Wiretapping. And our original idea sourcing comes from Drew A. Blank. The Unknown Webcast is a production of Midwest Christian Outreach, Inc. in cooperation with Emergency Manicure Productions, both of whom are solely responsible for this content, although you will never be able to prove that in a court of law. That's why we have those legal firm.
I need to change our copyright date now too.
I was thinking that too.
Well, it's good for 70 years. I mean, what do you want?
Oh, that's true. What do you want? That's good.
We won't be. Well, I might be here. You might not. But
all right. So for those who are still stuck here watching us, see ya.
Adios.